Eva Bennet sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, the smell of freshly brewed tea swirling around her as she absent-mindedly stared out the rain-speckled window. The city moved on without her, people bustling to work, car horns blaring in the distance, and the ever-present hum of life she had come to know as her normal. Nothing extraordinary ever happened to Eva, and she liked it that way, until the letter arrived. It had come with the morning's mail, tucked between advertisements and bills. At first, Eva thought nothing of it. Who would send her a letter? She had no living family left, no long-lost relatives to suddenly reappear with promises of reunions or warm memories. She tore open the envelope with a practiced indifference, but the contents inside were anything but ordinary. The letter was from a law firm she had never heard of, nestled deep in rural Vermont. It informed her, in clipped professional language, that her great-uncle, Nathaniel Blackwood, a man she had never met nor heard of, had passed away. He had left her his estate. Eva had to read the letter twice before it sank in. The words felt distant, unreal, like something pulled from one of the Gothic novels she shelved at the library. Her great-uncle, an inheritance. It seemed absurd. Her parents had never spoken of any extended family, let alone some mysterious uncle living in a remote estate. Her family history had always been a blank space, filled with the loneliness of being the last of her bloodline. Or so she thought. The estate was called Blackwood Manor, a sprawling property deep in the forested hills of Vermont. The lawyer's letter detailed that it had been in her family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next. But with the unfortunate passing of Nathaniel, the responsibility now fell to her. The responsibility to own it, to keep it, to stay in it. Eva felt an uneasy chill trickle down her spine as she stared at the letter. What was she supposed to do with a crumbling old mansion in the middle of nowhere? The very thought of uprooting her quiet life in the city to claim it seemed ridiculous. But then again, her curiosity began to gnaw at her. What harm could come from visiting the place? Maybe it would provide some long-lost answers about the family she never knew. 2 weeks later, Eva found herself driving through a dense forest that seemed to swallow the road whole. The trees crowded in on both sides, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Her car rattled as she drove over uneven ground, and she couldn't help but feel as though the forest were closing in on her the deeper she ventured. She tried to shake off the creeping unease, but it lingered, curling around her like a fog she couldn't escape. Finally, the trees parted, revealing a long, winding driveway that led up to a massive, decaying mansion. Blackwood Manor loomed ahead, its stone facade darkened with age and overgrown with ivy. The windows were cracked and clouded with dirt, like the lifeless eyes of a long-forgotten creature. As she approached, the house seemed to glare down at her, its presence oppressive, almost sentient. Eva parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the house in silence. The wind whistled through the trees, rustling the leaves with a sound that almost resembled whispers. A sharp chill ran through her, and she tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She had expected the house to be eerie, sure, but this felt wrong. It was as though the very air around her had shifted, growing heavier, darker. She forced herself to open the car door, the creak of the hinges cutting through the stillness like a scream. Gravel crunched under her feet as she stepped toward the front of the manor, the massive oak doors towering above her. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering just above the brass handle, before taking a deep breath and pushing the door open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and disuse. The grand foyer stretched out before her, the floorboards creaking underfoot as she stepped inside. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls like ancient skin peeling at the edges. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the dim light filtering in through the dirty windows cast long, twisted shadows across the room. Eva closed the door behind her with a thud that echoed through the empty halls. For a moment, she stood there, listening. The silence was thick, suffocating. There was no sound of life, no birds, no distant hum of the city. Just the oppressive quiet of the house and the faint rustling of the wind outside. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and forced herself to move deeper into the manor. The rooms were vast, each one more dilapidated than the last. Dust-covered furniture sat in frozen disarray, as if the previous occupants had left in a hurry and never returned. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, casting the rooms in shadow. It was as though the house had been abandoned, forgotten by time. And yet, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She wandered through the mansion, each creaking step echoing unnervingly through the long hallways. Her fingers brushed over ancient wood banisters and cold marble countertops, the textures strange and unsettling beneath her skin. There was something wrong with this place, something more than just the neglect and decay that had taken root over the years. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting. As she entered the study, her eyes were drawn to an old desk in the corner. Dusty, leather-bound books were scattered across the surface, and at the center sat a single stack of journals. She approached cautiously, the unease growing stronger with each step. The journals were old, their pages yellowed with time. She opened the first one, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the brittle pages. They were her great-uncle's journals. His handwriting was erratic, the words scrawled across the pages in a frantic, almost desperate manner. The entries began innocuously enough, mundane details about the estate's upkeep and weather reports. But as she read on, the tone changed. His words became darker, more chaotic. He wrote of strange occurrences in the house, of voices whispering in the walls, of shadows that moved when no one was looking. He spoke of a curse that had plagued their family for generations, a curse that was bound to the estate. "Don't stay after dark," he had written in one of the later entries. "The house isn't what it seems. There are things in the shadows, things that watch and wait. Do not trust the mirrors. And whatever you do, never ever look behind them." A cold dread settled in Eva's stomach as she read the words. Her eyes flicked to the large mirror hanging on the wall across the room. Its surface was dull and cracked, but as she stared into it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the glass. She quickly turned away, her heart pounding in her chest. Eva closed the journal and stepped back from the desk, her mind racing. Her great-uncle had clearly been mad, driven insane by the isolation, the crumbling walls, and perhaps even by his own guilt. But what if there was some truth to his words? What if the house wasn't just old and decrepit, but cursed? A creak echoed through the hall behind her, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes scanning the doorway. But there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, the walls lined with old portraits and more mirrors. But the feeling of being watched never left her. It clung to her like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. For the first time since she'd arrived, Eva considered turning around and leaving. This place, this house, wasn't right. It felt wrong, as though it was waiting for something. For her. But even as she entertained the thought, a heavy weight seemed to settle in her chest. Something told her she couldn't leave, not yet. She had to understand what had happened here, what had truly cursed her family. As the day wore on and the light outside began to fade, Eva found herself drawn to the mirrors once more. The warnings of her great-uncle echoed in her mind, but the pull was too strong. She couldn't resist. The house had her now. It was only a matter of time before it revealed its secrets. And Eva had the distinct feeling that those secrets would be more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. Nights in Blackwood Manor were long and unforgiving. Eva had tried to settle in as best as she could. She spent her days wandering the sprawling halls, cataloging the various pieces of antique furniture, and trying to come to terms with her unwanted inheritance. The mansion seemed endless, a maze of dusty rooms filled with faded portraits of her long-dead relatives, their eyes following her wherever she went. The deeper she explored, the more unsettled she became. No matter how many doors she opened or staircases she climbed, the house never seemed to reveal all of its secrets. There was always another room, another hallway that hadn't been there before, but it was the mirrors that began to unnerve her the most. They were everywhere, large, looming things that occupied nearly every room, their edges lined with intricate, faded carvings. Some were tall and thin, stretching from floor to ceiling, while others were wide and squat, their surfaces cracked and clouded. All of them felt ancient, as though they had been there since the house was first built. At first, Eva had thought little of them, chalking them up to remnants of an older time when mirrors were seen as symbols of wealth and status. But the longer she stayed in the house, the more she began to notice something off about them. The mirrors never seemed to reflect things quite as they were. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows flitting across the glass, or faint figures that disappeared the moment she turned to face them directly. At first, she blamed it on her own imagination. The house was old, her nerves were frayed, and it made sense that her mind might play tricks on her. But the strange reflections only grew worse with each passing day. It began subtly at first. She would see her reflection in one of the mirrors, only to notice that it wasn't quite in sync with her movements. A delayed blink, a slight hesitation before following her actions. Sometimes it was barely noticeable, just a fraction of a second off. But other times it was undeniable. Her reflection would stand still while she moved, or worse, move on its own when she was standing perfectly still. One night, as the sun began to set and the manor was swallowed in darkness, Eva found herself standing in front of the large mirror in the grand hallway. The glass was warped and dusty, but her reflection was clear enough. She watched herself for a moment, the flickering light from a nearby candle casting shadows across her face. And then she saw it. A figure in the reflection. A dark shape just behind her, barely visible in the gloom. Eva spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. She turned back to the mirror, her breath shallow, and saw that the figure was gone. But the unease remained, thick in the air like an invisible fog. The whispers began that same night. Eva lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind too restless for sleep. The manor groaned and creaked around her, the sounds of old wood settling in the cold air. But underneath the usual noises of the house, she heard something else, something faint but unmistakable. It was a whisper, soft and low, as though someone was speaking just beyond the walls. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. She sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the whispers faded into nothingness. For a moment she considered getting up, checking the hallways, but the cold grip of fear kept her rooted in place. She told herself it was just her imagination, the result of a sleepless night in a house too large and too empty. But deep down, she knew better. The next morning, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The mirrors seemed different, more malevolent somehow. She avoided looking into them as much as possible, keeping her eyes on the floor whenever she passed one. But the mirrors wouldn't let her go. No matter where she was in the house, she felt their presence, their glassy surfaces watching her, waiting. The journals her great-uncle had left behind grew more disturbing with each entry. His words were becoming increasingly erratic, filled with desperate warnings about the mirrors. He wrote of seeing things within them, things that didn't belong. At first, he too had dismissed the strange reflections as figments of his imagination, but it soon became clear that the mirrors were more than just glass. They were windows into something else, something dark and ancient. He spoke of the Watcher, a being that lived behind the glass, trapped between worlds. It was bound to the house just as the curse was bound to their bloodline. The Watcher could only be seen in reflections, always watching, always waiting. And if you looked too long, if you stared into the mirrors for too many nights, it would find a way out. Eva's pulse quickened as she read the last entry her great-uncle had written before his descent into madness. It was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and frantic. His final words were a desperate plea. Do not look into the mirrors after dark. That is when it comes for you. As if to emphasize the warning, the mirrors in the room seemed to shudder in the dim light, the glass distorting for a brief moment before returning to normal. Eva felt a sickening lurch in her stomach and quickly closed the journal, her hands trembling. She decided then and there that she would cover the mirrors. Maybe it wouldn't stop the strange occurrences, but it might give her some peace of mind. She gathered blankets, sheets, and whatever fabric she could find, draping them over each mirror as she went from room to room. But even with the mirrors covered, the feeling of being watched never left her. That night, as Eva lay in bed, the whispers returned. Louder this time, closer. She could hear them more clearly now, multiple voices, murmuring just beneath the surface of the walls. Their words were fragmented, elusive, but one word stood out, repeated over and over. Come. Her skin prickled with fear, her heart racing as she pulled the blankets tighter around her. She tried to block out the sounds, pressing her hands over her ears, but the whispers seemed to seep into her mind, relentless and impossible to ignore. Just as she was on the verge of sleep, a loud crash echoed through the house. Eva bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound had come from downstairs, from one of the rooms where she had covered the mirrors. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and hesitated for a moment before getting up, the beam of light trembling in her hands as she made her way down the winding staircase. The house was eerily quiet as she reached the bottom floor, save for the rhythmic creaking of the old wood beneath her feet. She moved cautiously through the hallways, every nerve in her body on edge. And then she saw it. One of the mirrors in the drawing room had fallen to the floor, the sheet she had draped over it lying in a crumpled heap beside it. Her reflection stared back at her from the shattered glass, fragmented and distorted. But something else caught her eye. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of her flashlight, stood a figure, a dark, twisted silhouette that seemed to pulse with a strange, malevolent energy. Eva gasped, the beam of light trembling as she tried to steady her breath. But when she looked again, the figure was gone, leaving only the eerie silence of the house behind. She knew now that there was no escaping it. The mirrors were haunted, and whatever resided within them had begun to cross over into her world. Her great-uncle's warnings weren't the ravings of a madman. They were a desperate attempt to stop whatever evil had taken hold of the manor from consuming the last of their bloodline. But it was too late. The Watcher had found her, and it wasn't going to let her go. Eva backed away from the shattered mirror, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. She knew what she had to do, but the thought terrified her. The mirrors were the key to whatever darkness lay within Blackwood Manor, and if she didn't find a way to destroy them, she might never make it out alive. The house had become a prison, and the Watcher was drawing closer with each passing night. It was only a matter of time before the mirrors would claim her, just as they had claimed the others before her. And now there was nowhere left to hide. The nights had grown unbearable. Sleep no longer came to Eva. Instead, she lay awake listening to the house breathe, to the creaks and groans of the ancient wood, and to the relentless whispers crawling through the walls. Blackwood Manor had closed in around her like a suffocating cage. There was no escaping it now. The house had her in its grip, and the dark presence within the mirrors had finally revealed its true form. The Watcher. It had been lurking just beyond the glass for days, hiding in the distorted reflections, watching her with hollow eyes that burned into her soul. No matter how many mirrors she covered, no matter how many rooms she avoided, she could feel it stalking her through the shadows. Eva knew it wanted something only she could give. The weight of the curse hung heavy on her shoulders, a sickening legacy passed down through generations of her family. But it wasn't until she found the hidden room beneath the manor that she truly understood the depth of the horror she had inherited. The entrance had been concealed beneath a thick layer of dust and grime, hidden behind a bookshelf in the farthest corner of the house. She had found it by accident, her fingers brushing against an uneven stone as she leaned against the wall in exhaustion. The panel had shifted, revealing a narrow, twisting staircase that descended into the bowels of the house. Eva hesitated, fear gnawing at her stomach like a living thing. But she couldn't turn back now. The house had led her here for a reason, and she had no choice but to follow. With trembling hands, she gripped the flashlight tighter and descended into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled her nostrils. The walls closed in around her, the passageway narrowing until she had to duck her head to avoid the low ceiling. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she pressed on, her footsteps echoing down the staircase as though she were descending into a pit from which there would be no return. At the bottom, she found the chamber. It was a small, circular room, barely lit by the faint glow of her flashlight. The walls were lined with broken, blackened mirrors, their surfaces scarred and cracked as if something had tried to claw its way out from within. At the center of the room stood an altar, old, ancient, and covered in thick layers of dust. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she approached the altar. A book lay upon it, its cover worn and weathered, the pages yellowed with age. The air around it seemed to hum with a dark energy, an invisible force that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She knew instinctively that this was the source. This was where the curse had been born. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the surface of the book. A shock of cold shot through her, and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They clawed at her mind, their voices shrill and desperate. "Eva," they called, "come to us." With a deep breath, she opened the book. The pages were filled with rituals, dark incantations written in a language she could barely understand. Her great-uncle's notes were scrawled in the margins, his handwriting frantic and disjointed. He had tried to decipher the spells, tried to undo the curse that had plagued their family for centuries. But in the end, it had driven him mad. As she flipped through the pages, the truth began to reveal itself. The mirrors were not just mirrors, they were conduits, gateways to another realm. The Watcher was not a ghost or a spirit, but something far older, something that had been summoned long ago by her ancestors in their lust for power. It had granted them what they sought: riches, influence, longevity, but at a terrible cost. The Watcher had bound itself to their bloodline, feeding on the souls of the Blackwood family for generations. Each time an heir came of age, they were drawn to the house, trapped within its walls as the entity fed on their life force, slowly consuming them until nothing remained but an empty shell. The mirrors were its prison, but also its means of escape, and now it wanted Eva. She was the last of the Blackwoods, the final link in the chain that had bound her family to the curse. If the Watcher consumed her, it would finally be free to leave the house, to wreak havoc on the world beyond the manor's walls. Eva felt a cold dread settle in her chest as the full weight of the revelation crashed down upon her. The curse was not just her burden to bear, it was a ticking time bomb, one that would unleash a horror far greater than she could comprehend if she failed to stop it. But how could she? How could she possibly defeat something so ancient, so powerful? She looked up at the mirrors lining the chamber, their cracked surfaces glinting in the dim light. The faces of her ancestors stared back at her from within the glass, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They were trapped, bound to the mirrors for eternity, their souls feeding the Watcher's insatiable hunger. Tears blurred her vision as she realized the truth. She wasn't just fighting for her own life, she was fighting for all of them. For every soul that had been consumed by the curse, for every Blackwood that had fallen victim to the darkness. She couldn't let the cycle continue. She couldn't let the Watcher escape. With renewed determination, Eva wiped the tears from her eyes and steeled herself for what she had to do. The only way to end the curse was to destroy the mirrors. All of them. She grabbed a nearby stone, her hands shaking as she raised it above her head. For a moment she hesitated, fear gnawing at her resolve. But then the whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices filling the chamber with a cacophony of desperate pleas. "Do it, Eva," they urged. "Free us." With a cry of defiance, Eva brought the stone crashing down against the first mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, and a cold gust of air blew through the chamber as the souls trapped within were released. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and convulse, twisting and turning as if in agony. One by one, she smashed the mirrors, each shattering with a scream of release. The Watcher howled in rage, its dark form flickering and pulsing in the shadows, but Eva didn't stop. She swung the stone again and again, until every mirror in the chamber lay in shards at her feet. The room grew still. For a long moment, Eva stood there, panting and covered in dust, her hands trembling from the exertion. The air was heavy with the scent of ancient rot, but the oppressive weight that had filled the manor was gone. The Watcher's presence had vanished, its connection to the house severed with the destruction of the mirrors. Eva let out a shaky breath, her body sagging with exhaustion. She had done it. The curse was broken. The souls of her ancestors had been freed, and the Watcher had been banished back to whatever dark realm it had come from. But as she stood there, staring down at the shattered glass, a chill ran down her spine. Something wasn't right. The room was too quiet, too still. And then she saw it. In one of the shards of broken glass, a faint reflection caught her eye, a dark, twisted figure lurking just beyond the edges of the mirror. Eva's breath hitched in her throat as she realized the truth. The Watcher wasn't gone. It was still there, still trapped within the shards of the mirrors, waiting, watching, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way out. Eva backed away from the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She had broken the curse, but the house would never truly be free. As she climbed the staircase and stepped back into the cold, still air of the manor, she knew she could never return. Blackwood Manor was a tomb, a prison that would never release the darkness it had housed for centuries. But even as she made her way toward the door, toward freedom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. The shadows shifted as she passed, and for the briefest moment she saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a dark silhouette watching her from the mirrors she had thought destroyed. She stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air, the house looming behind her like a malignant shadow. The wind rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees, and for the first time in days, she felt a semblance of peace. But as she walked away from the house, her heart still heavy with the weight of all she had seen, she couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror of her car. And in the reflection, she saw it, just for a moment, a fleeting shadow. The Watcher, waiting for the day it would be free. Eva swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away. She gripped the steering wheel and drove, leaving Blackwood Manor behind her. But she knew deep down that the Watcher would never truly let her go. It would wait, it would watch, and one day it would return.